Hey everybody, welcome to week 13 of the study of religious history from really 30 to 1500 AD, primarily looking at the history of Christianity. So week 13 we're going to talk about what some have deemed either the golden age of medieval Christianity, or we might say the golden age of Catholicism during the Middle Ages. And this time period is really on the cusp of sort of picking up right in the middle of the Crusades and sort of the next couple of centuries after it. So thinking about from 1100 to 1400 AD, we might say is the golden age of medieval Christianity. So two things that we want to primarily think about this week is simply the fact of first of all, how do we get to this golden age? Some might call it a golden age, or this really important time period, or really, it's just hard to describe it other than a golden age. This moment where Catholicism maybe is at the height of its influence. How does that arise? And then, secondly, we're going to talk about how the golden age begins to decline. Certainly not to the extent that Catholicism stops existing, but sort of you reach the peak at some point. It starts to begin to decline. We'll talk about how that happens. That'll also be something to be discussed in week 14, as well as we talk about that week with Renaissance and Christianity and some ideas there. So as we begin talking about this golden age, we might begin by way of introduction by thinking about it from this question, right? Why is this thought to be the height, or why would some say that this is the height of the golden age of Catholicism? Because of course we've already talked about, by this point, you don't have to worry about Roman persecution anymore, right? Pagan persecution against Christians, that's non-existent at this point. There have been other opportunities where you've seen the growth of Christianity, whether that's from Charlemagne and how he expands his kingdom and expands Christianity in that way. Think about a lot of different events. Why is it now that Catholicism is sort of assumed to rise to the heights that it does? So one thing that happens right in line with all that's going on from 1100 to 1400 AD is that you continue to see monasticism, not just the fact that it flourishes, but it also continues to develop and continues to adapt to society. And that's one thing that marks monasteries and monks and that whole system in a lot of ways, is that it's shown throughout history an ability to adapt to whatever's going on in society, which is odd because you think about a monastery, you think about seclusion from society, but as we're going to see, just because you're in a monastery didn't mean that you were always cut off from the world. And so you see a lot of adaptability from some of these monastic groups. We'll talk about that in a moment. We also, of course, note that it's at this point that the papacy is at the height of its power. Now, we sort of talked about that with the Crusades and the ability for the Pope to call a war. But when we think about it, too, there's going to be some other ways in which the papacy can exert its influence on the world at that time. There's also a lot of advancements that are going to be made in terms of religious education, I could say theological activity, in terms of just material about Christianity that's being produced, missionary work, architecture is something we're going to talk about at the end, that you still see the impact of it today, especially in Europe today. So, first of all, again, just as a reminder, or a concluding thought on that, right? The Golden Age is generally just tied to the prevalence of Catholicism and the power of the Pope. So, monasticism. All right, so we begin by talking about the mendicant orders, and we'll talk about that in a moment, what mendicant means. But just as a way of an introduction, the Crusades, they shaped the world militarily through the battles that are fought, but they shaped society outside of that. As this is going on, you've got a lot of travel, obviously, between Europe and the Middle East, and so cities actually continue to grow at this time, partly because of the importance of trade. Now that you've got people often interacting between Europe and the Middle East, and then even farther than that, as we'll continue to see moving forward, even though a lot of times they're fighting, but they still have connections with one another. And certainly trade is a way in which you gain goods, gain certain delicacies that you can't find back at home. So trade, the importance of it in a way is sort of renewed to a certain extent. So cities continue to grow. You've also got an economy now that is not relying so much on a bartering system of just trading goods for other goods. You've got more of an emphasis that's being placed on money. And so as a direct result of that, you continue to see an economic gap grow between the rich and the poor. Obviously, it's already existed, but it continues to grow. You can really see that in cities, which is probably similar in some respects to, what we see today. And so there's a growing need with the growth of cities that continue to gap between the wealthy and poor. There's a growing need for especially ministers or church clergy, as Catholicism would put it. There's a need for them to serve in cities, in part to help out those people. And so a new group or a new order of monk, or a new group or style or philosophical thought of a monk or a monastery develops to help those, to meet the needs of those people in cities. And the style that came across was begging, living a lifestyle as a beggar, as a monk. And this is in part ties in with the word mendicant order is that this is a new focus for monks and nuns as well, to sort of live the lifestyle of a beggar to try to help people that are poor in cities. We mentioned before Peter Waldo in the last video, I believe, that the founder of the Waldensians. He was a precursor to this because he, again, sold all of his goods to become a preacher and sort of live that lifestyle. There are two major orders that we want to talk about that come out of this, and they are called mendicant orders, and they are the Franciscans and the Dominicans. All right, so the Franciscans, their founder was a man named Francis. He had parents from both Italy and France. He took the name Francis, which meant little Frenchman. Francis, like Waldo and like the founder of the Dominicans, grew up in a very wealthy family. He one day decided to give up his possessions and to basically live on his own for a time period. He got into trouble with his father. It led to legal trouble concerning his inheritance and what to do about it. And he just decided at this point not just to give up everything that he owned, but he also decided to give up his inheritance as well. And so he decided to live alone. He spent much of his time rebuilding a chapel. One day he hears a sermon from Matthew, I believe Matthew chapter 10, where Jesus commissions, I can't remember right offhand if that was the apostle. He commissions some people to go out and essentially preach about the kingdom in Matthew 10. And there's a passage there that talks about not needing to take gold or silver or anything in their work. And so Francis takes that to heart, and he decides to live that type of lifestyle, sort of living as a beggar but also as a preacher. And what this does, and what the Dominicans are going to kind of be involved in this too, but what it indirectly does living this type of lifestyle was an indirect critique of a lot of church officials that had at this point that became wealthy and lived a fairly lavish lifestyle. And so Francis and some of these monastic orders are, in a way, a critique of that system. He gathers a lot of followers. Later on, he goes to the Pope, because in order to have your own monastic order, you have to get the approval of the Pope. I believe I mentioned that in the last video, and we'll continue to mention that as we go forward, but you had to have that approval. And so he goes to the Pope, and keep in mind, Francis, he's taking on a lifestyle of poverty. He's not dressed very well. He's dressed like a beggar. And the Pope essentially tells him that you're better off just going and wallowing in the mud, because you smell and look like a pig. Not a very polite way of putting that, we might could say. But Francis supposedly went out and actually got in the mud and came back and told the Pope, "I did what you asked." And reluctantly, the Pope allowed him to create his own monastic order. His order, the Franciscans, they did grow in numbers, and so there was a concern about leaving that type of lifestyle in order to maybe find prestige or wealth, because of just the number of members that are being added to it. And so in order to quell that desire, he made a rule or a law within his order that anybody that was a Franciscan could not own anything, could not own property or any type of possessions. They were not supposed to own anything. And so generally that's how it was while Francis lived. Now after Francis dies, so the post-Francis time period, you actually have a debate that develops between the rigorists, who agreed with Francis' stance that you cannot own possessions or things of that nature, and then you had the moderates, who were willing to bend the rules just to allow people to own things. So the matter gets involved and taken to the Pope. 1230, the Pope rules that the will of Francis is not binding. So the moderates were essentially free to practice the way they wanted to. And so some of these Franciscans began to own and use property. Some of this property that they used, they may not have directly owned it, but the church owned it. But still, that was sort of against what Francis had in mind. And the rigorists eventually nearly wiped out the entire group. They became fairly unpopular. But the moderates eventually became the major the major faction within that group, and so they were not wiped out. So if you think about the legacy of the Franciscans, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but they still exist today. The Dominicans exist today as well, not the Dominican Republic, but the Dominican order within the Catholic Church. But the Franciscans continue to exist today. In the United States and in the Americas, a lot of the early Catholic missions that were taken to in the Southwest and in the West, a lot of those missionary efforts were led by Franciscan, missionaries from the Franciscan order. So, we'll talk more about this in the next class, but within the United States history, for a time period, there was a strong, obviously there's a strong presence of Catholicism in Mexico, but for a while in the Southwest there was as well, as long as Mexico controlled some of that territory up until the Mexican-American War. A lot of the Catholic missions that were built during that time, and some of those missions still remain today, a lot of those missionary efforts to convert the Native Americans in that place, they were led by missionaries from the Franciscan order. So they have a direct relationship with the development of religion in the United States. And we may discuss that a little bit more in the next class, but that's in a way why they're important today. All right, so you got the other major group, the Dominicans, and their founder, his name was Dominic. He was actually, he likewise grew up in an affluent or a very wealthy lifestyle. He's originally from Spain. The type of monastic community that he had originally lived in was not closed off from the world. It turns out that he is actually influenced by the Albigensians. He was with another bishop when they went to southern France to deal with the group, I believe, because this is a group that, according to the church, promoted heresy. While he was there, he began to notice some things about how they lived. He was impressed by the fact that they did not live a very worldly lifestyle. They were very simple people, which, again, that contrasted the wealth of many bishops. And so, while he did not like the teachings of the Albigensians, he did find it admirable the way that they lived in terms of rejecting wealth and things like that. So later on, he goes and he creates a school that's primarily composed of women that have been converted from the Albigensian way of thinking. And at that point, he's given a church. He's also given the place for a monastic order. He goes to the Pope, but the Pope refuses to officially recognizes that. And so he adopts another rule and sort of the rules of another monastic group, and he just sort of unofficially ties in his ideas with it as well. And so there's going to be, within the Dominicans, initially there was a strong desire to abstain from worldliness and seek the lifestyle of, like the Franciscans, as of a beggar. And then at the same time also was the willingness to fight against the Albigensians. And really, and when you combine those two things, it was really a way, his whole purpose was a way to refute the arguments from the Albigensians that the church had become too worldly. So Dominic's idea, is we create this monastic order that doesn't live worldly, but at the same time can still fight against the heresy of the Albigensians. He's also influenced by intellectualism, and he places an influence on intellectualism or scholarly thinking, we could say. And this is the big difference between the Franciscans and the Dominicans initially. The Franciscans did not necessarily place an emphasis on the development, the scholarly development of the mind, we could say. So Francis had associated smart people essentially with wealth, people that are smart or wealthy. And so there's not a need for it. But for Dominic and the Dominicans, you needed to have training, you needed to have knowledge, you need to be well studied if you're going to be able to refute the doctrines of the Albigensians, which is what he does. And so the Dominicans would eventually produce a lot of scholars, which is, again, important for this time. The Dominicans are one of the first monastic groups compared to the Franciscans that they gain a foothold in the universities at the time, the two major ones being in Paris and Oxford. So within those universities, you would see professors who would be of the Dominican order. And so one of the most important Dominican professors that emerged was a man named Thomas Aquinas, who we'll mention a little bit about him in a minute. I believe if you studied anything about the history of Christianity, Thomas Aquinas is a very important person. All right, so due to the success of the Dominicans, though, later on the Franciscans tried to persuade or get involved in the university system as well. So you've got a renewed emphasis here with these monastic groups, but the important point, again, within all of this was their willingness to adapt to a changing society in which you saw the growth of cities, the continued tension between the rich and the poor, and two monastic groups that developed to try to appeal to those that were of the lower class, especially within cities, who were hurting. And that made them very effective in terms of having an influence on society. So you have them. Let's talk about now the power of the papacy. Again, the Franciscans later adapted. That's connected to their involvement with the university system. So with the power of the papacy, so we know, of course, about the ability to call for war during the Crusades. During the 1100s, while the Crusades were going on, you still had battles about control of the papacy. Sometimes this dealt with the loyalty of a bishop or the appointment of a bishop and whether or not he was more loyal to the church or more loyal to the region in which he was promoted. Again, you have regional tensions between countries. You begin to see rivalries develop between nations like England and France. Something that we will continue to discuss probably in the next lecture video. Innocent III becomes the Pope in a case where the Pope and the Emperor had died pretty much at the same time. And Innocent III is regarded by a lot of people to be the most powerful Pope that has ever lived in terms of his influence. And we're going to talk about a few reasons why that was the case. One of those reasons was because of his ability to and his willingness to get into matters of into other nations' matters. And I know we've talked about this to a certain extent, but with Innocent III, he does this maybe on a level that was unprecedented at the time in terms of how much he got involved with other nations. Because really the major powers in Europe, just about all of them, he got involved with in some way of handling some type of situation. All right, so first of all, we talk about Henry VI, concerning who was going to replace him. So Henry VI had died unexpectedly in a drowning accident. He had a son that at that point was too young to take over the throne. Henry VI's wife was obviously concerned about what would happen to her son, whether he would be killed by a rival. Eventually, Henry's brother is going to be appointed as the next leader of Germany, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. However, he has an opponent, a challenger, and his name is Otto IV. And just as a reference, I'm not too concerned about you getting all the names correct. I'm just giving you examples here of how Innocent III got involved with these nations. So you've got Henry VI's brother who's going to take over for him. Then you have Otto IV, who is the challenger. Otto IV is actually backed by Innocent III. You have a civil war that erupts. Otto IV becomes the emperor. Philip dies. Henry VI's brother, Philip, dies. Otto IV becomes the emperor. But Otto decides to betray the Pope, Innocent III. He goes and he tries to take the kingdom of Sicily, which is in southern Italy. He's unsuccessful in that. So Otto is excommunicated by the Pope, Pope Innocent III, and as a result, Innocent III decides to put Frederick, who was the son of Henry VI, on the throne. And what it signaled was that the Pope had the right to pick. The Pope had the right to pick who was going to be the ruler of Germany. He had that power. He got involved in that way. So he exerts his authority in Germany in that way. Philip Augustus of France. So the deal with Philip Augustus is that he had a hard time staying committed to his wife. He got divorced, I believe, on 3 different occasions. Or no, he had 3 different wives, I believe, in 2 divorces. These divorces obviously angered the Pope, Innocent III. And as a result of Philip Augustus' second divorce and getting with his 3rd wife, the Pope decides to forbid the observance of the sacraments, or the Lord's Supper being one of those things, to be given in the country. And what happens is that the church officials in France decide to side with the Pope. And so Philip, as a result, is left with no other choice but to leave his 3rd wife and return to his 2nd wife. And so in that way, Innocent III is successful in getting what he wants in France, getting involved with the marital life of Philip Augustus of France. A third occasion is dealing with the Archbishop of Canterbury, who essentially is the head church official in England. There were two men that were fighting over the office. One had the direct support of the king. They decide to get Innocent III, ask for his help. He goes in and decides to appoint a third individual named Stephen Langton. And if you want his name is Stephen, Stephen, and then Langton is Langton. He is actually going to be proposed by the Pope to become the Archbishop. Well, King John refuses this, and this is, by the way, this I believe is the same King John as the story of Robin Hood. That same King John. King John decides to refuse, and so Innocent III subsequently excommunicates him. And then, believe it or not, the King John refuses to abide by this or to repent in a way. And so Pope Innocent III actually calls for a crusade against the King of England. And so that goes to show you that the Crusades was a lot more than just attacking Islam. King John, the Pope Innocent III called for a crusade against King John. And the man who would lead the charge for the Pope was actually going to be Philip Augustus, who had already had to sort of submit to the Pope. And Philip Augustus didn't have any problem with that because France and England have long been rivals. We'll talk more about that moving forward. But after hearing about the potential for a crusade being launched against him, King John relents. And what happens is that England becomes a fief of the papacy. Not a thief, Thief, but a fief, Fief, of the papacy. So what a fief, Fief, is that it's a territory that is ruled by the king. In this particular case, it's a territory that is ruled by the King of England, but ultimate ownership of that land belongs to the papacy. So we might could think of we certainly think of there's a king in England, but he's sort of is only king because the Pope allows it in a certain way of thinking. That's the idea of what a fief is. Fief. The King of England, he is the king, but his power, his power, his land is really only granted to him by the Pope, is the understanding of that word. It's actually later on, if you've heard of the Magna Carta, it's later on that King John signs the Magna Carta in 1215 AD, which severely limits his power. And for us in the West, in the United States, you study the history of government and things like that. The Magna Carta is a very important document because it's one of the first documents and one of the more important, well-known documents that limited the power of a king. Well, when King John signed that, it obviously Innocent III didn't really like that because, King John, in a way, all that he owned was really in possession of the Pope. The Pope sort of ultimately held possession of all that. You also see something similar to this happen in Spain with Pedro II. We talked about before how the Spanish, they were taking back a lot of the land in Spain from the Muslims who had invaded. And so one of the things that Innocent III ruled was that the land conquered from those Muslim forces had to be given back to the church, had to be given back to the papacy. And so Pedro II had to hand a lot of his kingdom to the papacy. And in that way, Spain, like England, even though you have kings that ruled over those territories, it was symbolically seen that a lot of that land belonged to the Pope. And so by the end of that, you see, by getting involved in all these different matters, that's how the papacy grows in its power. Let's see, we're already at 30 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and stop it here. So we'll split this sort of into two different lecture videos. We'll pick up in the next video continuing this thought about the power of the papacy.